lost
On YouTube.
when I first
Yeah,
put
that's
it
right.
in this thing. But it's just something else at work.
All right, we're starting. All right, thanks, Andrew. All right, we're gonna get started. It is officially April 3rd, based on the weather outside, so that's kind of nice. But I heard it was raining this morning a little bit, even.
It was.
Yeah.
Really?
More tonight.
Who knows? Who knows? Like we were talking about this last night at the property team meeting. You know, just how much money Beautiful Savior saved in snowplows versus last year in particular, and we all just said, "You watch. It's just going to be like April's going to come and it's just going to pour. Like it's just going to dump all the snow." March 31st is Easter this year, right? You just wait. It's going to be that 26 inches Easter Sunday. Jeez. Yeah.
Birthday surprise for you, right?
Yeah, we'll get a good one. We're not done yet. We're not done yet.
I seen it like that in April.
Yep. Oh yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's the beautiful part about being a Minnesotan is we're so pessimistic, right? Like, it's just gonna happen. We just know it, right? You know, it's yeah, that's a quarter full. I like that.
Pessimistic or realistic?
Yeah, that's always the question I ask, right? Like, am I being a pessimist or are we just being realistic here? No, it's good. So I think last week we ended with Jacob being brought into the cave, being buried, and I think now we're just in verse 22 and kind of ending out that way the rest of chapter 50, which is the end of Genesis. And so it's the death of Joseph. It says, so Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put into the coffin in Egypt. I think I missed the part about the forgiveness. Let me back up there too. Okay? So how about, let's start in verse 15. How about that? We'll start there. So after Jacob had been buried, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph, saying, your father gave us this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Jacob dies. They carry him to the burial spot. And then we get this little moment. And I don't know, like in your Bible, what it might say. Some people say Joseph forgives his brothers, like as the title for that section. That would be, in my opinion, something that would just be incorrect. He's already done that, right? Here we have a little bit of a unique instance where the brothers are basically saying, hey, Dad's dead. Joseph may have been putting on a really good show for a really long time, right? And just waiting for that moment to all of a sudden say, hey, guess what, guys? Now you're in trouble, right? And there's some history in that. If you remember correctly, back to Jacob and Esau. What did Esau say? Isaac is on his deathbed, and he says, once that dad of mine dies, I'm going to kill my brother Jacob, right? So there's a precedence for this. They have a little bit of family history that would lend itself to kind of that thought process, right? And so they're very much coming in that fear, and even to the point of reverting back to some of their old habits. We don't have any recordings of Jacob actually saying this to them, right? They're trying to cover their own backsides on this stuff to make sure that Joseph doesn't take it out on them. And so we see a little bit of that cycle start to kick back up again. But what's so fascinating about this and what's so good about this is Joseph just ends the cycle. right? We could have gone back to Jacob and Esau, been in the anger, been in the bitterment, the resentment, taken 40 years to get over that, all of those things. We could have gone back to the same cycle of telling the stories, right? And playing the games and trying to one-up or whatever it might be. But instead, Joseph just says, no, this is done. There's already forgiveness here. And if you notice, it's rooted in God's plan, right? It's not rooted in, well, I just had the strength, or I just overcame this, or whatever. It's saying, listen, I know that the original part of your plan was not meant for good, but God used it for good. And that's just such a powerful testimony and a way to end those dysfunctions that come into our lives. And I know there's lots of different dysfunctions. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush. But it definitely helps to go into those cycles speaking the truth, right? Which Joseph does here. But also keeping in mind a godly perspective, right? Not just his own, not just his thoughts, but really what God had intended, and searching that out in the process. And we've talked about Joseph, how he stands apart from the rest of his brothers and even his family, right? He just stays faithful throughout. He's a faithful witness. His household, he marries into the priest's family, the Egyptian priest family, which is just red flags all over the place, and yet somehow, some way, he's able to remain faithful and even have them share that perspective of his about who God is for them. And a lot of that just keeps coming back to Joseph staying in that relationship with God, getting that perspective, and letting that perspective guide his life, so that he can get to a place of forgiveness, as he already is, but also so the cycles of dysfunction can kind of be done, right? So it's a powerful piece here that's happening at the very end of Genesis. It's a great way to end the book, because it really speaks to the power of God at work in people's lives and how it can, in practical ways, end just some awful, awful things. Yeah.
I had written in somewhere along the line, deception again.
Right. Like they're trying to go back to their old bag of tricks. Yeah, trying to come back to that deception. And Joseph basically says, let's not play this game, right? Let's just call it what it is. This is what happened. This is how we play it out. God meant it for good, and it was played out for good. And that's such just a powerful perspective and a hard one. Please do not hear me on that like, oh my gosh, just you're doing it wrong. All you got to do is this and you're fine, right? Like it's a hard thing. I can't imagine how hard it is for Joseph. We don't have everything every day that Joseph went through. We just don't have the time to keep walking through that kind of book, right? But there's no question that there were days of struggle and hardship in that, right? It's hard. It's really hard. But getting to that place is a powerful place to be. Yeah,
Isn't this just an application when you look at this, when you've got the brothers that all their lives they've been in this way, and you get Joseph as a look at Jesus, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got the brothers who just represent the sinful nature
Yep.
that we all have.
Yep.
So,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's another look at the condition of mankind.
Oh, for sure. This is one of the things of Genesis that people don't often think about. It's a lot of practical. It's not, I mean, there's a ton of things, as we've talked about, the two storylines, right? The story of Israel, the nation, how it gets established, and the Messianic line, how that gets established. And then you walk through the story, and it's just those two things kind of carrying through. But oh my gosh, there's so much of it where you just see yourself in it, right? And you see your own life in it. And it's just kind of unexpected in that way that you're going to find that much. And here's another example of that, where there is that practical application of, what happens in sin. The brothers very much embody that sin, right? But also the Joseph there, the brother Joseph is very much a type of Christ in that moment, essentially of just, it's all gone, it's forgiven. And we're going to talk about that on Ash Wednesday. Like, forgiveness is not just simply saying, well, I forgive you. Like, what Christ does is he takes on our sin to let it go, right? So in other words, he literally takes it upon himself. When he goes to the cross, what's he doing, right? It's not just the words, it's literally bearing the punishment for everyone's sins in the history of the world. He takes it all on so he can release it. And so when we forgive others, that's what makes it so hard. Is it's not just saying the words, it's saying we're going to be willing to take that on, to let it go. Not to hold it against them, not to use it over them, but to actually let it go. And it's not fair, right? It's just not fair to be in those instances. But that's a powerful place to be, and that's the place where Christ is in our lives, that he takes on our sin for the sole purpose of letting it go. And that's what we see of Joseph here. Basically says, I get it, you guys, yeah, we really messed up, but I'm going to let that go. I'm going to let it go because God used it for good, and this is where we're going to keep going with that. No, there's a ton of application. This little section here, this 15 through 21, you could preach probably 10 sermons on it. I mean, there's just tons in there. There's just tons. I won't, I promise. But you could. Eventually, you just get tired of hearing the same text week after week after week. You just, okay, we get it, right? So any other questions? Okay, so then we get to the death of Joseph. That 110 years that he lived is a significant number. It's a number that was seen in Egypt as like a godly number. So in other words, if you lived to be 110 years old, it meant that God had blessed your life. Okay? That's what it meant. And so anybody who lived to be 110, they're going, wow, that guy was blessed by God. And so it's not just a number of which he died. It's also speaking to his life and the blessing of God in his life. Yeah, what do you got, Jerry?
You brought it up before, we forgot. So after he died, how many years was it until they carried his bones back to the promised land?
Yeah, so how long after he died did they carry his bones to the promised land? About 300-400 years. And, well, 300 to 400 years before they got ready to leave Egypt, I should say. Because that's where Exodus starts, is about 300 to 400 years from this piece. So probably 340 to 440, somewhere in that time frame. Yeah.
The bones were still there.
Oh yeah, yep, they took him back.
They must have been embalmed pretty well.
Oh, yeah, well that's always kind of the interesting thing is, you know, as they're basically plundering Egypt, right? They're getting gold, they're getting silver, they're getting all these things. And by the way, I want the bones of Joseph too. And you're going, okay, like here you go, right? You can have them, right? It's kind of an odd thing, but again, it goes back into that promise of Joseph's got this land on this mountain that Jacob had won for him, that he was supposed to be buried there. So they wanted to honor that, I guess you could say, to observe that. But yeah, no, about, you could say 350 to 450 in terms of years. Yeah. Oh yeah, and he was there the entire time. Didn't move. And that's like, that would be the interesting thing. That is an odd thing to say, isn't it? Yeah. No one moved him. How about that? Like that might be the better way to say that. But I'd be curious to know, like, you know, you think of the Middle Ages, Dark Ages, things, you know, they have catacombs and things like that where they put specific bodies or specific people, right, and things of that nature. And I just wonder if that was part of Joseph too, right, where they maybe put him in a spot with the other well-knowns, I guess you could say, of the time frame. I don't know. I'd be curious to know if that's kind of how it plays out. But when you get to Exodus, that's where I kind of wonder about it, because it says you basically get a Pharaoh who rises to power who forgot about Joseph, right? Mm-hmm. And so if he's in this spot where it's, for me, as I'm just processing through that, if he's in a spot where, you know, the what do you want to call it? The people of notoriety in that time are buried there, you would think that then he would be remembered. So yeah, that's where I don't know kind of what does that mean for Joseph's remains, like where is he actually put? So, but he got to see his grandkids, even his great grandkids. Yeah. And if you notice, his last words there are very much a reminder of what's going to come. right? That God is going to deliver the people up from Egypt and bring them back home to the promised land. So there you go. Genesis. Any questions at all? It's too late. We're moving on. No, no, seriously though. Any questions?
Time of the writing, the authorship, time of the writing, purpose, bottom line.
In terms of Genesis?
Yeah, it's Moses.
Yeah, Moses.
Yeah,
Moses is
time of
the
writing
author.
is when?
Hang on one second. Let me see if we can find that real quick here again. Come on. I love my study Bible, but there's like 50 pages before you get to the actual book. They think somewhere between 1446 and 1406 BC, at least when they have that. Who knows, Ross?
That's right.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to know for sure, especially these first 5 books in particular.
Yeah. Okay.
Because that doesn't even really jive with like a young earth theory that often gets put forward
Yeah.
from Christianity, so that's
Yeah,
where I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
Well, there you go, Genesis. Who's ready for Exodus? The party continues, right? Here we go. All right. So Exodus. Couple of pieces of this authorship. Moses, still the author of the book. What's fascinating about this is that basically no one disagrees with that. Like if you look through all the different commentaries, all the different thoughts on a lot of the authorship of these books, even New Testament books, there's always questions and, well, could it be this or could it be them or whatever it might be. This one, there literally is no question. Like there's maybe one person who's like, it could be someone else. But like almost everybody is in agreement that Moses wrote this book. It seems like the easy one. I mean, it's really kind of about him to some extent, right? And the people of Israel. But there's very little question about his writing in this. And so the timing of the writing, as we kind of just talked about a little bit there, Jerry, about 300 to 400 years after the events of Genesis. So the timing of the events that we're going to start walking through, about 300 to 400 years after we read about Joseph and his passing. And the purpose of the book is to continue the story, right? You know, the things that have been picked up, those 2 lines of the nation of Israel, the Messianic line, those are going to continue through as we walk through Exodus. But it's also foreshadowing a Redeemer. Moses will be kind of that Redeemer type in the book. So as you look at him, he's going to display Redeemer qualities. You're going to look at him and just see some very strong ties to Jesus and who he is. But also primarily, Moses will be the one reflecting on that future Redeemer more often than not. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's very much those 2 lines coming through, but we're going to see more and more that Redeemer aspect coming through.
What tribe was Moses from?
Levites, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
Yep, Levites, yep. Yep,
His mom and dad were both Levites.
yeah, yep. And you don't, it's like Amram or something like that, I think his dad's name was, something like that, yeah.
Well, it's a meaning given to death, that Amram.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or was
I can't find it right now, but it was a meaning given at death.
Yeah, we find out in Exodus 3:6, you know, basically God says, you know, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in that there's a connection to another spot later in Exodus that identifies his dad as Amram or something like that. So, yeah. Because it's not really talked about. We'll start walking through this here. You know, Moses' birth is very unique in a lot of different ways from especially what we've been used to in Genesis. You know, there's just a lot of unique things about that, and part of that is like the parentage, right? The lineage, Some of that is even Moses' own name, right? So it's just kind of different. Yeah. So let's dive in here. Exodus 1 through 6. Let's start that way. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt, then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Okay. So we kind of have that connecting point. Like if you're looking at a puzzle piece, right? Here's the end of Genesis, and now you've got that puzzle piece that connects you to Exodus. A little bit of the story, a little bit of the descendants. The keynote there, they're all dead, right? So it's not like anybody is around who was there in the time of Levi, Judah, Issachar, right? You have some, obviously you have descendants of them, but those people are the main characters, if you will, from Genesis are all gone, right? But the promise in Genesis that Israel would flourish, that it would multiply, is very much alive and well. Okay. And that's what we see in verse 7. They are fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Couldn't go anywhere without walking into one of them, I guess. It's kind of the gist there, right? It's just that big of a group. And again, you think about that. We think about the multiplication of the nation of Israel. You talk about 70 people, 300 to 400 years ago, and now you're talking about a ton more, right? And it's going to be another 40 years before Moses flees, and then another 40 years before he comes back. So you talk about another 100 years in between that time. But the estimates to the people of Israel in the desert, high hundreds, low millions in terms of people walking around, right? So it is a very fruitful place, and they are doing exceedingly well in that place. Okay. So then we get into verse 8. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.'" Okay. So for the Egyptians, it's a little bit different. They're terrified. Israel has gotten too big, that if there ever is a conflict in there, Israel could revolt against Egypt and really cause them a lot of hurt, a lot of pain, right? So rather than trying to continue to work with them, he decides to take the alternate strategy and try to figure out how to oppress them, right? What's interesting is, yeah, go ahead.
That escape from the land confuses me.
Let's see here. Yeah, escape from the land. Yeah. So
He's saying he doesn't want them to,
correct.
but they're his enemies.
Correct. Yeah. So they're really good at building stuff for him, right? That's what we're going to find out here in just a few verses. The Israelites, that you would think that's the natural conclusion, right? If a group is too large for you, too powerful, get out, right? Leave. Take out. Just get out of Dodge, right? But then you lose a lot of your workforce. And they need a big workforce, especially when it comes to supporting their military, because that's what Israel was building. They were building storehouses for the military, right? So storage spots in different places. And so now all of a sudden you have a workforce problem if you kick them all out, which puts you at even greater risk. So it's a tactical move to try to keep the workforce the same, but also try to make sure that they don't rise up against you, right? It's not the best move in the world, right? Not the smartest thing in the world. And that's the thing, like, he forgot about Joseph. He does not know Joseph. if that's the case, like if he would actually remember Joseph, then there wouldn't be the fear. I mean, Egypt would have been in an extremely vulnerable place in those 7 years of famine, right? Instead, what does Joseph do? He doesn't expose it. He helps Egypt actually get stronger. And so maybe these people aren't so bad after all, right? Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe they actually want to work with us. Maybe we can figure this out. But because he doesn't know Joseph, because he doesn't understand that piece, fear, right? Fear and hostility and oppression become the way to handle this. So it doesn't have to be this way. If you just remember who Joseph was, and even that whole dynamic, that whole, what do you want to call that? Sorry. Oh my gosh, why can't I think of the word? The surrounding context. That's the word, context. All I could think of was climate. It's like, that doesn't do much for me. Context, that's what I'm looking for. Context. It would have been probably a completely different perspective. Because if you think about it, you think about the Pharaoh with Joseph, right? Back in Joseph's day. That Pharaoh had no concerns, right? Like, we've talked about that in the class, how almost loose he was compared to what we would know of Pharaohs, right? He's like, oh yeah, Joseph's got this, it's fine. No worries, yeah, whatever, that's fine. And that was a man who was greatly disturbed, troubled, right? Just saying, remembering some of those things makes a difference in how things get approached. Bill, you had your hand up.
Yeah, back in Genesis, at the time that Joseph was there, and he was stockpiling all this food during the 7 good years, the Egyptians all ended up having to sell everything they had to the Pharaoh, right?
Right, yep.
So how did they come back to power to now that they want to get rid of the Israelites?
So are you asking how the Egyptians came to that?
Because they were under the Pharaoh at that time. They
Yep.
didn't own it. The Levites still kept, because they were the priests, right?
Well, the priests of the Egyptian gods got to keep their land, but technically that was owned by Pharaoh anyways, because he gave it to them essentially to live on. So it really wasn't theirs to sell, if that makes sense. But no, I mean, excuse me. So you've got the people of Egypt who are under the possession of Pharaoh. And even before that, I think we talked about that briefly, how technically they already were, because they saw Pharaoh as a god, so whatever Pharaoh told them to do, they were going to do anyways, right? And so you have this dynamic where Egypt is already kind of under the ownership of Pharaoh, excuse me. And so they're naturally going to be more in alignment with those pieces because of just the differences in the nationalities, right? You have very much an us versus them mentality that's being developed here. And if you're an Egyptian, and we saw that sometimes with Joseph, right? Not so much Joseph himself, but not eating with his brothers because the Egyptians didn't eat with others, right? So you have some of those tendencies already there in your culture. Now you're basically adding fear into it, and they're going, boy, you know what? This Pharaoh, he's speaking some truth here. We really should be afraid. Let's make sure we're together on this. And then all of a sudden you've got that us versus them mentality. And it happens so often in history, right? It's not unique to Pharaoh here in Egypt. You talk about so many things in
So all the Egyptians rallied around the new Pharaoh because they were agreeing with what he was saying about the Israelites.
They were
becoming
afraid.
Powerful.
They were afraid. Yeah, they agreed with the new Pharaoh because they were afraid, right? Like I said, there's already some tendencies in that culture to be separate from other cultures, other nationalities. And now you introduce this fear element, and people are looking around going, you know what? He's right. There's a lot of them around there, and there's not a lot of us. We should maybe be afraid and really think this through. So it's not a hard sell. Like I said, there's been so many instances in history where that's been the piece, right? Where a leader has come to power and said, you know what, this isn't a good thing. And everybody's like, you know what, yeah, that really isn't a good thing. It's kind of how world wars started, right? Like, all of those go into those places. Yeah, it's a very common strategy, but it's a dangerous one. Nate, were you saying something? I'll get to you later.
It's just, as we read the rest of chapter 1, we realize the midwives, the ladies, you're getting to that.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, but go ahead.
And how they feared God.
They do. Yep.
So
They made choices based on that. Yeah.
they were loyal to Pharaoh on the outside,
Uh-huh.
but on the inside they weren't.
Yep. And that's one of the fascinating pieces about this Pharaoh as we walk through chapter 1 and even chapter 2. Nobody really listens to him. Like that's the crazy, like the characters we run into, like the midwives, or even like his own daughter, like doesn't listen to him. He's making these orders, these commands, what to do, all these things, and you're like, yeah, that's nice. We're gonna do something else. Like you just kind of go, huh? Like it's a very different dynamic. Yeah, it's a very different dynamic. Yeah, Lenny.
Yeah, how many pharaohs? I got lost in my pharaohs here now. We had the one that's, he was, basically a very nice guy.
Yeah.
And then the one now, is he the same pharaoh or?
No, different pharaoh. So it's been 300 to 400 years.
Oh, okay.
Since Joseph's pharaoh. We'll just say that. We'll just
Okay.
say it that way. So this is a new pharaoh, and there's, again, if the average lifespan's about 100, years, give or take at this point, so you probably have about 3 or 4 pharaohs.
Oh, okay.
And even when we see Moses flee and come back, there's a whole nother pharaoh that already has come into power because the other one has died by the point. So,
Okay.
there's kind of a movement through that. Yep. Yeah, Ross.
Three things here. One, question, why not just send them back? Well, with 300 or 400 years, you had people that, this is their land now. They
Oh, yeah.
live here. They live in Egypt. That's their home.
Yep.
Because everything, so sending back, would that be back to Canaan? Or-
Yeah, sending them back.
Then the other question is, when did the promised land come into the picture? Is this during, after? I might have missed something here, but where did that come in? Because
For the
they
people
did
of
leave-
Israel?
They did leave
Yep.
Egypt for the promised land.
Yep.
Or when did that become the reality? When did God say,
So-
I'm gonna send you the promised land?
So that'll come in the calling of Moses in chapter 3. Basically, what's going to be talked about in chapter 3 with God calling Moses is that he's got to speak to the elders of Israel. And the reason he's got to speak to the elders of Israel about this when he comes back to Egypt to bring them out,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
is because they're the ones who have been charged with keeping that in front of the people, right? So their job has been basically, this is great, but the promised land is coming, right? The promised land is coming. We got to keep our eyes there, got to keep our eyes there. And so once Moses comes back, talks with them, they're like, yeah, it's time to go. This is it.
Well, so when did it start? I mean, when did the promised land come? When did God introduce it to the people?
To the people, all the way back to Abraham.
What?
Well, all the way back in Genesis, talking about the promised land. Are you talking about the people now, though, in Exodus 1?
Yeah, I mean,
It's been-
everybody seemed to forget what happened the last,
But in the Israelite community, it's something that's been kept alive from generation to generation because that's the promise they're looking forward to, right? So even though life was good, they were multiplying and things.
all right.
They had the elders of Israel who were charged with essentially keeping that in front of them, right? So
Okay, all right.
you talk about you talk about the role of a church worker, right, or those who serve in the church. While we very much point to Jesus' death on the cross and resurrection, part of our job is also to point to that future when Jesus comes back, right? So we don't forget about that. And so it's not to say, like, basically it's kind of our job to make sure no one does forget that Jesus is coming back, because that's what we're ultimately working towards.
Okay.
Life might be good now, right? And I just say that generally speaking, right? Oh yeah, we've got this. It feels good. We just got a new grandkid, new child, whatever it is. Life is good. Yeah, it is good. But don't forget, Jesus is still coming, right?
Okay, all right.
And I think that's the perspective that's been taken in that 300 to 400 years. Is very
Or
much
more.
like,
I mean,
or
it
more.
must have been
Oh,
more, because-
well, and the from Abraham, Isaac to Jacob, all the way through. Yeah, very much.
All right.
But for sure, in that gap, if you will,
Yeah.
that we don't have recorded history of in Scripture,
Yeah, yeah.
that's been the charge. That's been the piece. Yep.
All right.
No, good question.
But we get in Genesis 15, we get the promise that God makes to Abram
Oh. Mm-hmm.
that there would be a promised land.
Correct. Yep.
You're enslaved for 400 years, Egypt,
Yep.
but then you will get a land that will be your own.
Yep.
So in answer to Ross, the people knew that they were gonna have a promised land all the way back
Mm-hmm.
to the beginning, like you said, to Abram.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. That's been
Yeah,
around generation after generation after
Thank you.
generation. But that gap in particular, very much it was the elders who kept that in front of them, right? So that you didn't lose sight.
All along,
Yeah, all along. Yep.
yeah. got it.
Because you don't have with Jacob passing, it's the end of the patriarchs, right? So you don't have
Yeah.
like a family head anymore. You've got tribes. So it's a very different, how do you want to call it, government system, right? No more is it just, well, Levi's the head of his household, so Levi is just going to make sure that his family knows about that, right? Like you've got all the tribes now, and how do you
Yeah,
make
yeah.
sure that happens?
Got it.
Yep.
Yeah, I oops,
No, it's a good question, Ross. It's a great question. Yep. Let me say it another. No, I'm just kidding, Ross. I'm teasing you. I'm
I
teasing you.
think you covered it.
Yeah.
And Nate,
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah. But just to make sure, no, just no. All right, so basically, he said we got to deal with them. We got to deal shrewdly with them. We want to make sure they stay, so they keep building these really awesome buildings. But we also can't let them continue to multiply, right? So then we get into verse 11. And this is where we see why he wouldn't want to send them back. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Okay? So those are the storage places for the military that essentially Israel was building for Egypt's military. So why not send them back? Because he needed military storage. It's a big deal. Egypt's military is second to none at this point, right? They are just a powerhouse. And so they need those places. And those places would act as supply centers, places the army could go replenish, essentially, if they were out on patrol or whatever it might be. So then it continues, it says, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So just taking a step back, running into this for a second, Egypt is not just coming up with the idea for the first time of how to oppress somebody or oppress a group of people. Egypt at this point is pretty well experts at this, right? They've invaded other countries, they've invaded other lands. They know how to do this. It's kind of like the Roman Empire and executions, right? They knew what they were doing with crucifixions. It's not like, wow, somebody just discovered this when Jesus died. That's incredible. No. They really knew what they were doing. And so the Egyptians, in their oppression, they know what they're doing, right? This has worked in other places, so it's going to work here. And yet the exact opposite is true, right? Instead of actually making it worse for the people in terms of like the numbers shrinking, declining, it actually gets bigger and it gets better. And that's been true of God's church throughout history, right? You see that in churches that are underground, and especially governments that maybe are oppressive to Christianity. They try to thumb it out, right? They kind of just try to squash it, but every time they squash it, it just continues to grow and multiply in ways that get out of control. It's just incredible to see. So there's a pattern there with God and his people and how he works, that whenever it seems to be a terrible time for his people, there seems to be blessings that come in amazing ways from that. Yeah, Ross?
Yeah, I'm just curious about the military of Egypt at
Yeah.
the time. If Pharaoh saw to the ascension of Joseph, who was second in command in the whole of Egypt, was there some kind of special that Israelites could not become part of the military? Because it seems with the proliferation or the population growing the way it was, I mean, were they kept from being in the military, or?
So this is eventually what the Roman Empire ran into, right? So when the Roman Empire conquered places or countries or groups, they would often then inscript the people from that group into their army. And at the beginning, there was enough obedience and enough of a ratio where you could control that, where you weren't worried about that group turning against you, using your own weapons or strategies against you. But as the Roman Empire got older and more brittle and it got more expansive, it became harder and harder to control that. And so essentially what happens is those internal groups that you enlist into your military, suddenly they're not so loyal when they see opportunities to rise up against you.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about this fear that they already have of the Israelites, joining their enemies in an uprising,
Yeah.
they're not going to let them be in the military, probably not even going to let them get near a weapon to be near a military, right? So it's that thought process of, yeah, they're a big group of people, but we're still better armed, and as long as we're better armed, it'll be okay. But as soon as they get their hands on those armaments, whether because they're in our military or because they find something, it gets to be a little bit more problematic. Plus, if you remember back when Joseph brought his brothers before Pharaoh, he picked 5 of them who looked like shepherds because that was what they needed to be, right? Pharaoh was able to make that distinction, so if anybody came in, yeah, you look like a fighting man, go fight, go in the military, right? You look like you're a scholar, go write, and kind of divided jobs that way. And it was very important that the 5 Joseph picked had the appearance of shepherds, herdsmen, because that's where they needed to be so that they could be in the land of Goshen. And so I think there's also some of that too, where you have that, well, Israel's really good at herds and shepherding and all those things, so we're just going to keep them there and not put them in the fighting force. Now, it's not to say that the Israelites didn't have people in the army. They may have, I don't know. But I think from where this is at, it's highly unlikely just because of the paranoia and the fear of this Pharaoh, but also just because they were so good at their shepherding job, they wouldn't be allocated to those places.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about, during those 400 years,
Yep.
how
And that's right.
however, how many were in the military
Yep.
at that time through 3, 4, 5 pharaohs,
Yep.
that it got to that point. I mean, that they wouldn't.
And I think that's probably leaning more into that piece of that they're a shepherding group more than a fighting group.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so that's where I would lean more into that piece
Right.
of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that essentially, they're just herdsmen. Don't worry about them. They can't
Yeah,
fight.
got it.
Yeah. And if you think about it, they really didn't have to fight until they left Egypt, right? I mean, there wasn't like this major battle between them and Egypt that took place. It wasn't until they started entering the Promised Land, doing their wandering in the desert, that they actually had to start fighting. Yeah. So Israel continues to grow and continues to get worse for Egypt, at least in their perspective, in their own minds. So we're going to try to change the strategy up. Oppressing them ruthlessly is not working. Taskmasters, they're doing their best, but man, it's just not doing what they need to do. So verse 15, then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. Okay? So, in other words, kill the males so that there's no heirs. Females would marry into the Egyptian families. There would be what do you want to call that, a conversion there, if you will. And eventually you just breed out the Israelites. That's essentially what would happen there. Yeah, that's the change in strategy. Going after the sons. And you see there in the study guide sheet, there might be a passing resemblance to the strategy in Matthew 2, 16 through 23.
Yeah.
So this is where you start seeing some of those connections, right?
It's Herod, right?
Yeah, it's Herod,
Yeah.
right? So Matthew 2, 16 to 23. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. Okay? So we'll just stop there because that covers the gist of it. So what Herod did in Matthew 2 is a tried and true method, right? It's not something that he came up with on his own. It very much has some background in the Old Testament. But again, this is where we start to see the familiarity come through, where we see those connections between that Redeemer and the people of Israel, right? And so it's not necessarily making a one-to-one connection there, but it is just to say that there's some familiarity happening here, right? There's some commonality happening. Nate, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, sorry, I thought you had a question. I apologize. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because they killed all the male children. Now, is that how Moses managed to escape?
We'll find that out. How about that? Huh? Huh? How about that?
Spoiler alert.
Huh? 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 We'll get there. We'll get there.
I got a McDonald's truck.
Yeah, that's good. McDonald's good. I like that. Ross, what's your question?
Well, it's kind of a view of Herod trying to kill Jesus.
Right.
I mean,
Yep.
there it is. I
Yep.
mean, you gotta look at the future.
Yeah, and it actually is, there's a stronger connection that happens in just a few short verses as well. Absolutely. Yeah, you Herod trying to kill Jesus. And yeah, the imagery is too strong to ignore. It's too much of a connection to just kind of, that doesn't connect at all, right? So and then verse 17, as Nate talked about here, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So you want to talk about what was the most important thing for these midwives. It was God, right? It was that relationship with God, and it determined their actions and how they behaved, how they moved forward. Yeah, or sorry, Jerry.
Oh, I'm just correct.
Man, you guys are just throwing me off today. Stretches. Did you all like talk beforehand? Like, all right, I'm going to do this. That's good. Yeah, that's right. Interesting how paranoia becomes the first thing I go to, right? Like it just has to be that. Following right in line with Exodus 1, 100%. So yeah, they're not going to listen to Pharaoh. And that's a strong statement. This is Pharaoh. This isn't just some guy that's telling them to do this. This is, you're disobeying the God of Egypt, if you will, right? So it's such a small piece, but it's such a powerful statement to their faith in God and who he was, right? So then in verses 18 to 19, the king of Egypt hears about this and basically wants to know what's going on. It says, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Okay? So in other words, we're just running late. I don't know what to tell you. We can't get there in time, right? It's a bald-faced lie, obviously, but it's also, what's he going to do, right? Like, you need to get there 5 minutes earlier? Like, what? He's not going to argue with that, right? So it's pretty wise on their part to figure that out. But essentially, that's how they get through it.
Probably worked really well with his fears, too.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, it played right into the fears when you think about that, John. Oh my gosh, they are really strong. They give birth before our women do now, right? Like, you could just see, like, all the propaganda coming from that, right? Like, oh my gosh. Yeah, it just fed right into his fears. That's good. I actually like that. Yeah, that's good. Oh. Yeah, and so from that, there comes blessings in verses 20 and 21. So God dealt with the midwives with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Okay? So they began to multiply in their own families. And even in this way, you could see them now being incorporated into God's people, right? Because who are the only ones who are multiplying, at least in vast rates? God's people, Israel, right? And so now you have this piece where they are basically brought into that. But what's also fascinating about this is we've seen in the past where there's been moments like Abram and Sarai who went into Egypt, right? Abram said, this is my sister. Sarah gets taken into the household, and then basically people are unable to have kids, right? Because there's this disapproval from God in what's happening there. You could argue that that's essentially what's happening here. It's an odd thing that the blessing would be, well, they get to have families, unless there is a struggle in the land for the Egyptians to have families, right? Which then would feed into the fear. Listen, they're multiplying. We're really struggling with our population, right? And so it's just a little piece there. I don't have anything that really says that's how it was being played out, but it's just an odd blessing because it's such a thing that would be very common, very typical, right? And yet it's not seeming to be a very typical thing at this point. Yeah. So no worries for Pharaoh. He is a problem solver, right? Verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Okay? So fine, you guys give birth a lot sooner. Anybody who sees a Hebrew boy, toss him in the river. Easy enough. Yeah, Jerry.
Explanation. So Jacob is referred to as Israel.
Yep.
And the tribes, so then you call them Israelites.
Yep.
Okay? Now they're referred to as Hebrews.
Yeah.
So what, explain the difference between a Hebrew and Israelite, or they mean the same thing, or
Yeah.
where does the term Hebrew come from?
Yeah, the word Hebrew was actually first used in Genesis. I believe it was with Abraham, reflecting. I'm trying to remember exactly what that was, Jerry. But I think it's a play on Abraham's name, if I remember correctly. Hebrew, because Abraham was first called the Hebrew. He was the first one who was called that. So it's something there. But essentially it just refers to the people of Israel. So whether that's the people of Jacob, Israelites, Hebrews, all the same group of people. Yeah, just different ways to describe them or talk about them. And that's always the interesting thing as Moses writes this. You know, we saw that with Jacob, especially towards the end of Jacob's life. We'd go from one verse where it'd say Jacob said, and then Israel said, and then Jacob did, and then Israel did. And you just have that.
It kept going back
Yeah.
and forth.
And it'd just be, I don't know that anybody's, lack of a better way of saying it, figured out why the rotation and why not just stick to the name change, especially because that was a name change for Jacob, from Jacob to Israel from God, right? And so why wouldn't he be known as that all the way through? When it was Abram, we didn't know him as Abram after God changed his name to Abraham, right? It never went back. Same with Sarai. When it went to Sarah, it never went back. And yet here with Israel, Jacob, it just kind of fluctuates through. So I don't have a good answer as to why that is, but it's all referring to the same group of people. Yep.
Pastor?
Yeah, go ahead, Ross.
Oh, go ahead.
No, Nate, go ahead.
The word Hebrew
Yeah.
was used by the foreigners as a derogatory term for Israelites. Find that in Genesis 14:13.
Could you repeat what he said?
Yeah, he said it was used as a derogatory term to describe.
Usually an ethnic term in the Bible, it was normally used by non-Israelites in a disparaging sense. That's
Yeah.
my note.
And see what I have here in my study Bible, and this is where it came from. What I was thinking in that,
Yep.
the word could derive from Eber, of whose lineage was Abram. So in other words, those coming from Eber, Hebrews, like that's kind of the piece. So I'll look a little bit more into that to make sure, because boy, it'd be an odd thing to, if it's a derogatory term, to have Moses continue to use that.
Comes out of Genesis 14, verse 13.
Yeah, right. Yep, that's the first usage of it.
First time it was used.
Yep, first time it was used with Abram. Yep. Yeah, it says the one who escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew.
Hebrew.
Yep. Yeah, I'll look into that and bring it back.
So is, they're still killing babies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and this sounds like a massacre thing to me, like, is this an ongoing, operation, you know, just searching out baby boys and killing them? And is that the premise for them moving out of Egypt, or, you know, the Exodus?
So what the thing is with their exodus out of Egypt, what prompts that is just it's time, right? And there's the oppression. God talks about multiple times in this chapter, in chapter 3, because God doesn't speak until chapter 3, that the oppression of the people has just gotten too large. It's too heavy. It's too big. He hears them, right? And it's time to do something about it. And that would very much fit into the oppression that they're experiencing. Yep.
And there must be just massive numbers of babies
Yep.
that are being killed.
Yep. 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 Yeah, assuming that people are following, right? And that's the other piece too, because you do have some who are choosing not to, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but they're growing, you know. and-
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
She
You
said,
can't-
nobody listens to this guy.
Yeah. It's just
Right?
it's an interesting thing. Yep. It's an interesting thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
I visualize that when I read that, yeah.
Any other questions before we wrap up chapter 1? All right, let's get into chapter 2 here. I think it's good stuff that I want to build off of that because I think chapter 2 builds off of that point. Okay. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and dabbed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me." Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." Okay?
You got paid to raise your own kid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good gig.
What a deal.
Yeah.
I'm telling you. You want to solve a birth rate problem, pay people to have kids. That'll do it, right? No. So at the end of chapter 1, we have that very dark ending to it, right? Basically cast all the kids into the Nile, right? All the boys, they need to go. But then you start chapter 2 on kind of a higher note there, right? There's this man from the house of Levi, had a wife who was a Levite woman, and they bore a son. Okay, so it ends low and kind of works its way high, and then it kind of dabbles around there a little bit.
Do these people ever have names?
So that's a great observation, right? When you look at Genesis, right, the child is born, and immediately what happens? The name is given, right? Moses doesn't get a name until the very end of this section of text, right? And it's not even given by his mom, it's given by Pharaoh's daughter. So it's a very fascinating thing. That's what makes Moses so unique in this, is he doesn't have a name recorded. That doesn't mean he didn't or wasn't given a name, like when he was born, but it's an interesting thing that you have Moses not having a name until this end of section, but then also his parents aren't mentioned at all, right? And so you don't get any names through this. Okay? So even like his sister, no name. Pharaoh's daughter, no name, right? The servant, no name. You just get descriptions and things. It's a very unique text. Yeah, it's a great observation. That's what makes it so unique, is that there's just no names. It really isn't. And especially for a child being born. We see this throughout. Like even when Moses has his family, name given, right? Just right away, name is given, right? So it's just a different thing. And it's hard to understand why or know why, but it's just something that's unique to Exodus there. But we are told he is a fine child, right? You know, essentially, when she figured out that he could be raised and be a well-behaved child. No, I think essentially what that's referring to is good health, right? But it's also the same word that's used in Genesis, describing creation, right? So when at the end of each day it says it is good, right? It's the same word. Right? So, in other words, that this is good. This is very good, that he's a healthy child, that life is good for him. So then we see that the baby is left and found. Moses got to a point where she couldn't hide him anymore. Had to take the basket, put the bitumen and pitch in it, and put it in the river among the reeds. And she basically walked away at that point. She left, which is understandable for what she basically left him there to do. She didn't know what was going to happen. At best, he might survive. At worst, he dies. And she just didn't want to see that. Okay. But the sister stays behind to see what would happen. Who knows how old the sister is? I don't know if that's an older sister, younger sister. We do know she's nosy. No, just kidding. No.
It wouldn't have been a younger sister.
What was that?
It wouldn't have been a younger sister to Moses.
Tell me more.
Moses
Because he's
was
a
an
baby.
infant.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's true. So it is. You're right. Good call, Bill. You were a math teacher, right? Yeah, so putting 2 and 2 together, you got it, man. You got it. So older sister. And we know, so 2 things we know now, older and nosy. There we go. You can write those down. Older and nosy. For sure.
And she has a name.
And does she have a name?
Her name is Miriam, because that's the way it was in the movie.
Oh, sure.
I got the basket of water.
I love that. I love that. Miriam, because it's in the movie. I like it. I like it. That's good. That's good. No, yeah, Miriam, yeah, is eventually the identified child there. Yeah. So
Was the sister?
yeah. So we'll end it there, but just to kind of come back to what you were saying, Lenny, about that. So why would Pharaoh's daughter pick up a child and automatically think that it was one of the Hebrew children? Because he was a boy, and he was in the river, which is where boys were put by order of Pharaoh.
That's true.
Right? And so, yeah, you can talk about maybe the circumcision piece or whatever it is, but if you were to find a child in the river, and it was a boy, based off of Pharaoh's order, it most likely was a Hebrew child.
Yeah, it was in a basket too.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yep.
Was it wrapped with Hebrew clothes?
Yeah, I think there was something.
That goes back to the movie again, Ron.
No, I don't know. I don't know how it's talked about, the basket's coated, right? So it doesn't like sink, it floats, right? And okay, I'll just go into that part real quick. The word there that's used for basket is actually the same word used for ark in Genesis. And it's the only times in Scripture that word is actually used to describe the ark and to describe Moses' basket.
Wow.
Yep. So.
Is there a Messiah message here too?
Yes, you guys are getting. See, we got to do this again. Like it just goes down the rabbit hole real quick, right? And it's good.
This baby was lost,
Yeah.
but now found.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, something like us.
Yeah. Oh, you can make that
Lost and then
connection.
found.
It's a tease, Jerry. It's a
Ah,
tease.
deep.
Next time.
Right?
Yeah. And yeah. Nick.
Even if Moses had been named prior, how would they ever know that he was named prior?
Well, he wrote the book. He could have put his name in there.
Well,
No, but that's the thought I've had, Ross, Nick, sorry, is why this is the, like, if anybody's going to put the name in there, this is the time. Like, it's your name, man. Like, what do you got? But we don't even know. Like, he doesn't take the time.
Yeah.
You just go, okay, So either he didn't have one, like legitimately just didn't have one, and was just called child or something like that for 3
Well, how
months.
old was he when he was?
Well, at least 3 months. At least
Yeah,
3 months.
Yeah,
Yep.
but he wouldn't know his name if, I mean,
Maybe, but we'll see. See you guys. Just let this play out. Let it simmer. Let it play out. It'll be good. It'll be good. Just enjoy. All right. Just it's kind of like a fine steak. Just let it go. Right? No, it's good. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the study in Genesis and the things that have been brought forward in that, and thank you for Exodus as we continue in that journey. And Lord, just help us to make those connections, help us to understand some of these things better, but more importantly, just see you at work in it, in your redeeming, in your love and grace that you show in history, but also to us today. And so we pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. We will have Bible class in the morning, and then we'll do Ash Wednesday worship. Okay? So that's next week. So yeah, come back next week. Yeah, we'll do morning. Yeah, just.